you mentioned, I'm on the advisory committee on open banking. I'm in a very enviable position right now in that I don't have to actually answer any of the questions. I get to ask the questions. These poor schmucks up here have to answer the questions. I will introduce the schmucks, although Chris Hansen is going to have to introduce himself because he didn't send a bio, unless you'd rather have Dan introduce Chris.
You do not want that.
Darius, can you wave to the audience? That's Darius. He's the Chief Innovation Officer at Blank Labs, where he collaborates with enterprise clients on building the next generation of digital solutions. That sounds really cool. He is a seasoned entrepreneur, which I think is another way of saying old, in the tech space. He has several leadership positions, such as VP Tech of Flexity Financial and CTO of CanPages. Did I get all that right? Mostly. We have Victor. Victor, where are you? At the end there. He's the tech guy on the panel, so ask all the hard questions to him. He's the VP of Data Science at Judy.ai, an automated lending platform. He has, and I'm reading here, strong analytical and data-driven background. He is actually he spent how many years researching experimental nuclear physics?
10 years.
That didn't pay well. You're here now. Prior to Judy, he worked at Loyalty One's Air Miles program, and before that, Outside Intelligence, which is a startup that was acquired last year by a New York company called Exeger, where he helped building their core award-winning product, DDIQ, a cognitive computing platform that uncovers and analyzes regulatory risks, which is probably going to put me out of a job since I'm a lawyer. Dan. Dan is the Senior VP and Chief Digital Officer of Equitable Bank here in Toronto, Canada's ninth largest independent bank. He leads EQ Bank, Equitable's digital banking arm. He's also responsible for all technology, strategy, delivery, and operations at Equitable, as well as project management. He also empties the garbage and takes out the trash. And Chris.
So I'm the CTO at Co Financial. We are a digital financial services organization focused primarily on digital natives. And I'm also the CTO at Portage Ventures, which is a venture capital firm focused primarily on fintech and insurtech.
And those are our fine debaters today. We are debating not open banking necessarily, it's more about the role of data in open banking. So for those of you that have been sleeping through the last 6 hours, open banking is really about, it's not so much about banking as it is about opening up transactional information currently held by incumbent banks to third parties. That's done with the consent of the user. There's another aspect to open banking, which is about initiating payments by third parties, but we're not really going to focus on that today. Now, when you start opening up your systems to third parties, all sorts of issues arise. The ones we're going to focus on today are privacy, security, and liability. So no contentious issues there whatsoever. So starting with privacy, open banking models, as I mentioned, are premised on the idea that individual consumers are able to control their own information. For instance, I should be able to direct an institution that holds my data to share that information with a selected third party. Now that notion is pretty straightforward. It's kind of a motherhood statement. Individuals should control their own data. That sounds lovely. But what does it actually mean? More control over my own data, more access to my own data. Let's throw it open to Victor. What do you think? What does that mean to control one's own data?
Yeah, I think that the whole idea is quite understandable. Like the customer should be in the center of owning his own data. That's pretty straightforward and clear. I think what's actually hard to visualize is how we get there. So there are some steps that will be needed to get there. So what does that mean? So if data as a concept is understandable, but there is a lot of technical things behind it. So the data is usually stored in places. There are several tables behind. Those are things that are not very visual to the consumer. The consumer knows he wants to have control, but what does that mean? Control to what? Do you want access to all your tables? Do you want access to the detailed view of that, or you want access to the concept? So if that's what the consumer actually wants, then we need to translate that technical part of the data is sitting into something that could be shared, something that the customer can take and maybe give to a third party, or if that is just a consensual part, maybe the consumer only says, yes, you are allowed to get in, but then the third party gets that information through their site. So there is a lot to figure out how that gets done, so that the idea is clear. The concept, I think the hard part is how you get it done, how it's actually something you can execute on that.
Chris, did you have any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've had, like, consumers have had access to their data for a while, but I think what's missing is the concept of like number portability in banking. Like, if I want to pick up my banking relationship and I want to move it, right now it's a really painful experience because I don't really own that data as a consumer. That belongs to somebody else. And I think what would be interesting is if consumers could, have a selection in the market, make a decision, and then kind of move their relationship somewhat easily. To me, that's, what open data is about, the experience more than anything. It's about, like, what are the kinds of experiences that we're driving for consumers, and then, like, how do we work back from there to make sure we have the regulations and the portability that we need.
Okay, so you're suggesting that data portability or data access be a fundamental principle, and then we build everything around it?
Yeah, I think if we think about the consumer experience that we want, where we want consumers to be able to, manage their relationships with their financial services organizations and move them where they want to for them to be able to take their data and their data history with them, I think is important.
Does that create any problems? I draft privacy policies for a living, and I know none of you have read any of my work at all. You probably clicked on the button, but you probably didn't read it. There's a real problem with consumer understanding, and privacy policies are just one symptom of that. So who should bear that problem of consumer understanding? In other words, should financial services providers be taking steps to increase the privacy literacy of consumers? Should it be mandatory? Should there be standards or required language around consent? Should there be a pooled fund for privacy literacy in Canada? I'll start with you again, Chris.
So, I mean, I think we've seen, in the last year or so, we've seen kind of what happens when people are kind of clicking through these privacy agreements and not really reading them, and then companies are doing things that are creepy with that data. So I think that.
Define creepy, please.
Well, I mean, if you're taking a survey and then you're taking that data and using it for other purposes, I think it comes back to, like, reasonable disclosure, having a transparency of intent, as we're collecting that data, as we're using that data. I know, I think, like in Co, I think a lot about the data that we're collecting. We have everybody's, every one of our customers, when they transact with their card, they're making a statement about their lifestyle. They're making a statement about who they are. It's a very private space. We have to treat that data very carefully. We can have agreements that say that we can do all kinds of things with that, but I think that there's an onus of care, and there's a need for us to be reasonable with what we're doing with that. And I think a lot of that goes beyond the legalities of what's in the declaration.
Sorry, can I just jump in? I think the question that you had about where the burden is, I think, is in two parts, right? If there's an expectation that we should be doing better in terms of, if I want to expose the customer data to them, they should be able to ask for specific things and kind of have control over, what it is that they're kind of getting. And then the burden ends up then being on both the fintech or whoever they kind of asked to get that data, but also on the institution that holds the data, that puts it out, actually having the granularity and the control over the different elements within it to be able to expose that kind of properly and not the other things, right? Which I don't know that either are there today, but it means that there's sort of a bilateral burden there. I think both players have a part to play.
Just, and this isn't on the script, so I'm going to ambush you here. Some jurisdictions have imposed mandatory language around a consent. So whenever if you're an incumbent bank and you're going to push your data out to a third-party provider and you have a consent, it's standard language. Everything, it all says the same. For or against?
Me or the panel?
I'm going to put you on the spot,
right.
Then I'm going to move down the panel.
I think there's going to be some gray in there. I think we have to figure out how far in the gray we want to go, right?
That sounds very lawyerly.
Yeah, thank you. I do that in my spare time. I'm a banker during the day. But I think there's going to have to be kind of an examination of maybe the jurisdictions around the world that have done this, and maybe I'm guessing everyone has an opinion about where they've gone too far and where they haven't gone far enough, and maybe find something in the middle, which, the typical Canadian way, wait until Europe, the UK, and Australia do it, and then kind of take an amalgam, right? So.
What about the others on the panel? Standard language, pro or con?
I know that this is what you do for a living, but most of the users do not understand privacy policies. It's a friction in adoption of any digital journey that people come and they don't understand it. They don't read it. They say, yes, go ahead. So I'm pro for common language. Make it plain, simple.
Down to the end?
Yeah, I think I agree. Like majority of people just go through and just click whatever's in there. I want it working as soon as possible, faster. So the common language will help. Is also maybe how extensive those things are. Maybe make it very crystal clear and very concise. What are they agreeing upon, and not a really long 20 pages to read to actually understand what or don't understand what is in there.
And Chris, strong views?
I'm against standardized language. I think it should be customized because I think every business should be allowed to be its own entity and have its own strategy. I do think it should be like limited like a tweet. Like you can't have a privacy agreement that's longer than 140 characters.
Okay.
It should be limited and simple so that people understand it and can digest it.
Okay, I'm so out of a job. I want to just a quick survey. Standardized language, if you're in favor, put up your hand. Interesting. So you'd rather read the privacy policies? I'm not seeing any hands.
Privacy tweets.
Privacy tweets. Okay, privacy tweets are the future. It's going to make my life challenging. Okay, moving on to security, which is another hot button issue. Some argue that there's already a form of open banking that exists in Canada. Organizations are already engaging in screen scraping. I think most of you know what that is. That's a process whereby the consumer who holds the account provides their credentials to a third party who then uses those credentials to automatically log in and essentially pull the information off the screen. Typically, the users in that case are aggregator sites. Some see no problem with this. They think it's a viable option and it should continue to be part of the open banking regime. Others point out that it's a security risk that imposes a burden on the consumer and some risk on the consumer, particularly if things are going to go wrong. The alternative is to use APIs, which is essentially a secure pipe, but there's problems with that because not all institutions may want to design these pipes. There may be multiple pipes. In any event, you're getting more interaction and more threat vectors. So should screen scraping be permitted in an open banking regime? Should APIs be required? Do APIs address the concern about open banking being insecure by its nature? We'll start with you, Dan.
There's a lot in there. I mean, I personally am not a fan of screen scraping. It feels like a hack to a customer demand, which is that they do want to see all of their information in one place. I think it's problematic. I mean, for a number of reasons, the topic is security. So it basically requires the customer to give away their credential and password in the operating model as it is today, give away their credential, username and password to some other third party who then holds the data in an unregulated environment. So I think fundamentally it's got some gaps, and I don't think it's a proper representation of open banking. I think open banking actually, again, gives the customer the control over what data they let out and when. Scraping means I can get anything that's in that online banking profile, even if that's not what I wanted you to see. So fundamentally, I've got definitely some issues with it. It's hard to stop without being really draconian about it. People scrape my site all day long, and I sometimes turn them off and sometimes let them go. But I don't want to disaffect the customer. Depends on the
kind of day you're having?
Yeah, it depends on the kind of day and how they're actually behaving, frankly. But I get, I don't want to turn it off because there's a customer out there who wants to get that data. It's their data. So I don't love how it's hitting my servers, but I have a hard time saying I'm not going to let it happen. But I would much rather have someone come to me and say, I need an API, here's what I need, and I'll provide it.
Darius?
I think open banking scraping is not open banking. It's a byproduct of a lack of open banking. Okay. That's my opinion. Like if you do have proper open banking APIs, you don't need to scrape anything. So it tells us that there is a demand, there's a need for open banking. That's why the market is building all these scraping tools in order to address the need. But going back to one of the questions that you had is that do banks all want to do this or not? In my opinion, if a bank already has a mobile app, they already have APIs. They've already unlocked their data. They've already built all the layers of making the data available through an API for their own internal usage. So it's not that difficult for them to extend that with proper governance that the regulators will put on place and for the whole ecosystem to adopt that. And it's a marginal extra effort in order to make the APIs available.
Victor?
Yeah, I basically agree with Dan and Darir. So screen scraping first is a hacky way of getting the data out because of the lack of something else, the lack of a proper way of getting it. So the way you get that data is actually error prone, and it's not exactly the way we should do it. And I think the answer is actually APIs, or APIs is a way of showing structured data in a very concise way. So basically, the data is basically stored in databases inside the companies, which are, or banks in this case, which is very well structured, very well understood. We translate that into those UIs. So we translate that to be displayed to the customer in a certain way. Now we're asking the scrapers to extract that information when it's already structured somewhere in the database. So the API will actually expose that structured data for third parties or anybody to use. So I think that's the way. The question is, of course, what to be exposed, what the banks will expose through these APIs. They for sure have some infrastructure built already because they're using web mobiles and applications with that. So they have that to certain degree of structure. So the question is, what should they be able or not to expose to the public, to third parties? That's a whole world there. So that needs to be addressed.
Okay. In some jurisdictions, APIs have been mandated by law. In those jurisdictions, many parties complained that the financial incumbents that did publish the APIs, they were clunky and hard to use, and some even accused the incumbents of doing that deliberately. So if APIs are to be preferred, which is kind of what I'm hearing here, should they all be built according to an open standard that levels the playing field, or should it just be left up to individual institutions and organizations to work it out? You continue, Victor.
Oh, definitely. So the idea is, I believe, is if we leave that to the banks, they will probably gonna have a very long way to get what third parties needs and what the customer needs. So actually, we need to come up with the standards first. What needs to be exposed, and then work that way backwards. So they get that API to that structure. So that's the way I think it should be done.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think there needs to be a standard there. I think for a couple of reasons, just to actually get everyone out, and maybe even a timeline. So that's a bit kind of contentious, but maybe there should be a timeline for when certain applications get out or APIs get out. And then I actually think it'll help foster more, I think, fintech innovation or other people that actually want to consume those things, because it's just easier if you can sort of, build once and sort of apply it to different FIs to get sort of access to data versus having to build something independent for every bank that, or not just bank, but every institution that kind of actually opens these things up. I think it has to be there.
So the other third contentious issue is around liability. It's just by nature of open banking, when you open up a system, it envisions non-traditional financial service providers accessing information and accounts, typically held by regulated entities. So the regulated financial institutions have pointed out, and they have a point, that they're the ones bearing the regulatory burden. And if something ultimately goes wrong, it's their responsibility to make the consumer whole. So should this continue to be the case in an open banking regime, or should some of the risk be borne by non-regulated participants? And if so, how? How can you make that meaningful? Maybe you should be regulating non-regulated entities. What's the solution here? Who am I going to pick on? How about Chris?
So, I mean, I do think that there's a need for a thinner and lighter regulatory regime in Canada. I think, 5 years and $1 billion is a lot to ask when it comes to creating a new charter. We do need something that fintechs can work with, that they can manage. But I also think that this argument that open banking is bad and scary because of security is a very shallow argument. If we really want to look at threat vectors, if we really want to look at where the risks are, there's a lot of legacy systems in banking, which is where the real risks, I believe, lie. I'm a recovering chief architect from banking. I I've had those sleepless nights. I have different sleepless nights now, but I would say that, when I look at the world of fintech and I look at the world of banking, I much prefer the risks associated with fintech. I mean, a lot of these companies have one database, one application server. I used to do a joke. I used to kind of have a joke that I would do with chief architects of major banks, where I would ask them this very simple question, how many systems do you have? And just watch as they would try and figure that out. They don't know. So to not know how many systems you have and then try and secure those systems, I think is the real.
They're building a system to count all the systems, is what I'm hearing.
There are systems that they'd use to count all the systems. I used to manage the system that would count all the systems, and as soon as we did an acquisition, that system would be out of sync. So I think we should have a real cybersecurity conversation with consumers in the industry. We should be serious about this, but we should really focus on real threat vectors and not try and use cybersecurity as a scare tactic to slow down something like open banking. We should have an honest conversation about cyber.
I saw you nodding your head there.
Yeah. Just to add to that, going back to the liability, most of these privacy policies or terms and conditions you read is to protect the bank or the financial institutions. And there's some liability given back to the consumer that if you use your chip and PIN card, for example, somewhere, it's your fault. So it's nothing different than if you use a token for digital banking. If I use my debit card on an ATM that is not the bank's ATM and is at the corner of a convenience store, it's connected to the same rails. So if the banks allow that, and that is okay, if I have now a digital version of that as a token, I can go and set up the bank's mobile app. I want to use the fintech's mobile app. It connects to the same rails. It should connect to the same API.
So what you're saying is those sketchy corner store ATMs are just perfectly fine and I should continue using them?
Yeah, you can use them because
you heard it here, folks.
It's as secure. That's all I'm saying. It's the same security.
Well, and actually still on that liability front, I mean, if you look in your terms and conditions of use at any, for online banking, for any of the institutions, you'll notice the only time that you sort of violate your own security guarantee with that bank is if you actually use your username and credentials somewhere, give it to someone else who isn't them. So anybody who's using the third-party aggregators, you're actually sort of waiving your right to be compensated if fraud happens. And in some cases, you've got the banks working with those third-party aggregators who are saying, go use that tool that we endorse, but by the way, if you get sort of defrauded because of this, you're going to be out your money probably at those other banks because their security guarantees will not be in effect. So we're pushing a lot of the liability out to the customer actually right now. So as much, chip and PIN kind of push it to the merchant, like this actually pushes it to the customer. So it's worrisome, I think, as long as we are still kind of using that, as I said, hack of account scraping.
Well, one thing that happens there is the bank, like I'm working at fintech and we're actually doing data access using that way, is that the bank first or the financial institutions first check whether you have a secure environment. Like before you're able to, or they allow you to, or the customer to get the credentials to you as a third party. We are a third party now at Judy.ai. There is a lot of security screening before that happens. So it's not just that straightforward. So
Just mindful of the time, go to the last question, and that is, what is the role of the regulator? Canadians love regulators. I love regulators. Regulators keep me in business. Should open banking be pushed out onto the financial services sector, or should it be market driven? I'm going to start with Dan on this one.
I mean, it's kind of a broad question, but I'll throw it in. I actually think the government does have a big role to play here. I actually think it should be maybe not down to every API level, but I think there has to be sort of a pretty clear guideline, like expectation of when banks are meant to comply with this, what compliance sort of means there in terms of the kind of APIs that we want to see exposed, the kind of privacy protection we expect to kind of be there. So if it's guidelines versus prescriptive, I'm fine with that. But I actually don't think that it's going to serve Canadians well to sort of let this happen incredibly piecemeal. And with, you're not really sure whether your bank sort of does this or not. You're not sure whether the providers do this or not. You're not sure the spec that it works at. You're not sure the different security levels or the different privacy controls within each. I actually think there does need to be some level of guideline there, if not outright, being prescriptive.
Darius?
I agree that the government plays a big role here, but what motivates the government to do something is my question. Because the market has to do something. Either the consumers have to go and say, I have this need, or the market needs to create a scraping or something that is moving the needle towards there so that the government and the regulators, see the opportunity that it's time to make that call. And I think we're marching towards there. I don't know if the regulators are hearing us. I'd love to have a panel like this, to have regulators sitting here next to me and answering the questions and not us. I think that's where the real motion is going to happen, but that's my 2 cents.
Anybody else? That's not bad. We have another. Oh, you have. Okay.
So, I would say, and one of the things that I tell my team is that, the regulators aren't going to move the boundaries themselves. We need to be kind of pushing up against the boundaries to have them evolve. I think when it comes to open banking, we need consumers. I think the Canadian regulator and the Canadian banks really respond to consumers, and that's been clear in the past. I think if we want open banking to emerge, we need to show the consumers how their lives are different with open banking solutions and what that means for them, and then we can push the boundaries together. I think both government and market have a role in that.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do with open banking is actually changing the status quo so that how things are working now. And in order to do that, there is always a bit of resistance, I think, in the beginning, but there needs to be some driving force. The driving force could even come from the government or from the market, from both, but there needs to be some driving force to get this going, let's say, to get this started. And it will start like high level rolling down from the high level details of what needs to be put in place, but then it needs to roll down until how those APIs should look like all the way down to that level of detail, so to make it work. That's a journey, basically.
Thank you. I'm going to throw it open to questions if anybody has anything they want to stump the panelists with. Well, you're all thinking of some questions.
Well, from a CLA perspective, so we put a panel like this together, which is great. We're going to film it, it's going to be socially available, a la Snapchat. But what
Socially available, is that a thing?
But what can we do to get away from just talking among ourselves? What does the industry association need to do? What do we need to do as individuals to push the envelope forward?
Well, from my own perspective, because I know you're all passionately engaged in this topic, and if you weren't half an hour ago, you are now. The advisory committee is soliciting views on open banking. You will see a consultation paper that will be published in draft form soliciting views, and there will be stakeholder consultations. So as I know you are passionate about this issue now, please make your views known. Either as by yourself, through your companies, through an industry association. We are soliciting all manner of views in that.
Right. And you think that that's the envelope, that's what we should apply energy to push this forward? That's what's going to drive this.
The more views are better. Let's put it that way.
The industry groups are putting together views on this and working models and stuff like that, but I think it's going to need to come from a few different sources to kind of get to the right answer.
So you'll see this roll out over the next year or so. So keep an eye on that, and by all means, please contribute to the discussion. And a question. Yep.
Okay. Sure.
Here.
It continues to seem like we're. That works. There we go. Wow, that's much louder. Continues to seem like we remain incredibly short-handed in terms of access to alternative data sources for consumers in Canada relative to the other clearly much further ahead countries on the global scale. But yet at the same time, privacy regulations in Canada only get tighter and tighter, and the Canadian government seems incredibly hypersensitive to consumer privacy to the extent that they're just layering on what seem like more and more boundaries. Is there anything happening to try and get industry to push more aggressively towards not being so hypersensitive to privacy regulations and being more willing to open alternative data sources up for public and business access that could stimulate some of the innovation that we lack here? to anyone's knowledge.
I actually think probably, Kirsten, this is probably for you.
I think this is probably for me. This is my practice area, strangely enough. If I understand the question, it's really about how much data is out there and why don't we have access to it? Is that, I'm paraphrasing that?
Yes, to a much lesser extent in Canada than is available
Mhm.
anywhere else. And it doesn't seem like we're heading in the right direction.
So there's an interesting contrast. Various jurisdictions looked at open banking, and most of the jurisdictions looked at the financial services sector and said, okay, this is called open banking for a reason. You, financial services sector, come on, we're going to start with you. Australia did it a little differently. What they did is they started by looking at a consumer data right, which essentially said consumers should really own their own data. They should control it. And then the Australian government turned to the banks and said, okay, we're starting with you, but telcos you're next, utilities after that, and then we'll kind of move down. So it's starting from a principled basis. We have not seen that in Canada. Doesn't mean it won't happen. So right now the discussion is really around open banking. But to your point, there are alternative data sets that are out there. Most fintechs and some incumbent banks are trying to gather it piecemeal, but there's no aggregate sets. Like you can't go to Rogers or Bell and say, I want access to that consumer information. I can't go to my utility yet. So you correctly point out that that is an issue. We saw the recent kerfuffle over the StatsCan request from the banks, which again, you see that very, very much a reluctance to not only share information, but attention between the holders of information and those that want to use the information. Is it going to change? Privacy legislation is up for review. We got pressure from the GDPR, which is the privacy legislation in the EU. We have to maintain what's called an adequacy standing, or personal information can't go back and forth between the EU and Canada. So there's a lot of pressure to make changes to the legislation. What direction it changes is up to the people in this room. So when that comes around, I encourage you to make your views known on that as well.